Good morning. My name is Mark Baer. This is the first episode of Muse. And Muse was inspired by a show I used to listen to on the radio years ago in Los Angeles called Luncheon at the Music Center. And where they'd be in a live space and people would come together and you'd hear plates clattering in the background. So if people walk through our set, it's because we're open. I'm executive director of the Museum of Monterey. Muse means to inspire. Muse also means to reflect. Today, my guest is Peter Coniglio, and we're going to reflect upon his grandfather, Pietro Ferrante. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Let's talk about you a little bit, about who you are.
I was born and raised in Monterey and spent basically all my life here, except for college and the service. I'm an attorney. I had city government experience in the planning commission, city council, and I was also mayor. So we basically have spent our whole life here, raised our family here, and we're very glad to be part of Monterey, I'll tell you.
And so this is still the Sicilian American community that your grandfather came and was part of founding in this area. This community is still alive and well and prospering after all these years, and it's a great American story which we're going to go back to. Now, just for a bit of reference here, a couple of weeks ago we had the Italian American Cultural Center Foundation held an event here. We dedicated a wall upstairs to the Sicilian fishing industry, Sicilian American fishing industry.
I recall that, yes.
And one of the things that was discussed at this, it was a great event. We had a lot of people from the community in, a lot of people who'd never been in this museum before. And one of the things that we discussed was the ways in which a museum can work with the community to document their history, and the importance, as particularly in this particular instance where fishing was such a big part of Monterey, to make sure that we're documenting it now while those stories are still available. And so this, my interview with you this morning is kind of the next phase of that, where we're really sitting down and we want to get some of the stories.
The Sicilian colony has made a great contribution to the city of Monterey and the surrounding areas. And it was all really started by my grandfather. His name was Pietro Ferrante. I'm named after him. Pietro is Peter in Sicilian. And he came to Monterey in 1903. And the circumstances that brought him here were a fire that occurred where he lived in Pittsburgh, California. That's where he had settled. And a fire came along and burned basically all of his possessions there. He had his own pier, his own fleet of boats. He had a home, a boarding house, a saloon, and that was all burned. And they didn't have insurance in those days. And he had 3 children at that time. And he had heard about Monterey, about the plentiful fish that were here. And he came to Monterey and got hooked up with a Mr. Booth, who had a small cannery down by what is now Fisherman's Wharf. And the fish were plentiful, sardines, and he brought his brother-in-law and his cousin and started to bring all of the Sicilian colony. And over a period of 50 years, they built the largest sardine industry in the world. During World War II, they caught as many as 400,000 tons of sardines during the season, which was only 6 months long, from August to February. There were 26 canneries on Cannery Row, over 100 large fishing boats called purse-seiners because they used the purse net, which my grandfather introduced. And it became, as I say, the largest fishing industry until about 1948, when the sardines disappeared mysteriously. The fleet went out one night and the fish were gone. And over a period of about 5 or 6 years, it just began to decline, and it finally collapsed. and Camarillo became a ghost town.
So let's go all the way back to Italy.
Okay? The story of my grandfather's migration to the United States is a very interesting one, and it's similar to thousands of immigrants that came to this country in the late 80s, 1880s. As you know, in Europe in those days, there was no middle class like you and I. Either you were a nobleman or a peasant, and if you were a peasant, there wasn't much opportunity for you, no matter how hard you worked, ambitious you were. And there were thousands of people in Europe, like my grandfather, that had the desire to achieve, and they'd heard about this America where they could come and work hard and become something. My grandfather was born in a little village outside of Palermo in Sicily called Isola delle Femmine, Island of the Women, because originally it had been a women's prison years before. And his family were poor fishermen, and as soon as you could walk on those days, you went to work to help support the family. So by the time he's 14 or 15, he's a master fisherman, fishing the Mediterranean between Sicily and Algiers. And he was a hard-working, ambitious young man. And he was betrothed to my grandmother when they were born, which was the custom. And they were first cousins, Nonna Rosa. So he goes to Nonna Rosa and says, I am going to go to this America, and I will be successful, and you must wait for me. So he comes to America. He's about 17, they think. He lands in New York, gets a job on the railroad because he wanted to get to San Francisco where the fishing was. Takes him 1 year to work his way across the United States, digging ditches, $1 a day. Finally gets to San Francisco. He managed to save $50, and he buys himself a little boat, and he starts to fish. And he's a master fisherman. You know, they fish 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. He's a hard-working, ambitious man. And he begins to get very successful.
Now where are we now?
He's in San Francisco, between San Francisco and Pittsburgh on the river there.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Nonna Rosa, back in Isola, is waiting for him. And she waits for him 10 years.
Wow.
And the people in the village were telling her, he's never coming back. She says, no, my Peter promised me. So after 10 years, he becomes relatively successful. He goes back to Italy, marries Nonna Rosa, brings her to Pittsburgh, brings her father, her mother and father, her brother, and the whole family. And he's relatively successful. And then a fire comes along and burns everything. And he's about 40 years old, I think, by that time.
So what year are we now?
Well, he came to Monterey in 1903, so it's right at the turn of the century. So he comes to Monterey, and he was well known in the fishing industry because he was a prominent fisherman. And Mr. Booth had a little cannery here down near Fisherman's Wharf, and he told Mr. Booth, if you will stake me, I will catch you tons of fish. Now, in those days, they fished with a gill net, where the fish would fly into the, and he said, they just catch 200 or 300 pounds. He says, I will catch you tons of fish, and he brought the lampara, or the lightning net, which they still use, which is the purse net. And anyway, then he brought his brother-in-law, his cousin, and the industry began to build. And then a lot of other families came, and as I say, they built the largest sardine industry in the world. My grandfather built one of the first big canneries called the San Carlos Cannery in 1925. That's about where the breakwater is now. It's gone. And then he subsequently sold that and retired, but then he went back in and built another cannery just before the war down in Oxnard, or Port Hueneme. But when the war started, the government sequestered the plant because it was on the ocean, and he moved it up to Monterey. It was called the Oxnard Canners, and that's where the Monterey Plaza Hotel is now. So that's the way the industry, and as I say, it was a very, very lucrative interest for all members of the industry. The boat owners, the fishermen, the cannery owners, the cannery workers. It was the main economic engine for this community for 50 years. The other economy was based on the military. And so in about 48, 49, when the industry began to collapse, the economy was severely hurt. And a lot of the Sicilian fishermen, because they are a very determined, hardworking kind of people, they began to change and get into other activities, restaurants, construction. And today we have a large colony of successful Sicilian people because of that determination and ethic. You know, they have a very strong work ethic, like a lot of people. So they have contributed a great deal to the peninsula. And I'm very proud to be a member of that ethnic group. Monterey has been good to our family all these years. And we were raised by my grandfather and my father that it was important to give back to your community, not just to take. So I was privileged to be able to serve in Monterey government for over 20 years. And that was, it was exciting, frankly, to be mayor of your hometown.
Okay.
But after a while, I had enough, and I went into other ventures that we have other business interests now in the community.
When we come back, we will continue with Peter Coniglio.
The Museum of Monterey at Stanton Center is for the community, by the community. Our mission is to tell the stories of Greater Monterey with an emphasis on history, arts, innovation, and our maritime heritage. Throughout the year, we bring you intriguing exhibitions and stimulating events. But to continue to be a center of excellence, we need your donations. Please become a member today. Simply go to our website, museumofmonterey.org, and push a button. And if you make a larger donation, I will come to your house and sing you a medley of your favorite love songs. And remember, the Museum of Monterey at Stanton Center could be the perfect location for your rental event. Check it out, museumofmonterey.org.
Welcome back to Muse. I'm Mark Baer, your host. My guest, Peter Coniglio. And when we left off, we left your grandmother back in Italy.
Well, again, as I said, she waited for my grandfather for 10 years, and then he went back to Italy and married her and brought her and her family, parents, brothers, all to Pittsburgh and settled there. My mother was born. My grandfather had 6 daughters like I do, and 3 of them were born in Pittsburgh and 3 were born here in Monterey. The Sicilian women were just as talented as their husbands. They were hardworking, they were supportive. My mother often told us she loved and admired her father because he was quite a leader. But she said, I admired my mother more because she said her mother, they never saw her mother in bed. When they would go to bed at night, my grandmother would be up making net for her husband in a rocking chair. She gave birth to 12 children.
Wow.
Only 6 survived, 6 daughters. She had 6 boys. They all died either at birth or early. So my mother remembers her mother always with being pregnant and holding a child and cooking, because my grandfather had a large compound up here above where the wharf is, and a lot of his fishermen that he brought over from Italy would eat with the family, and my mother and her sisters and my grandmother would do all the cooking for them. It was a hard life, but my mother says, we were very happy. They didn't have much until my grandfather became more affluent later on in life and built the cannery and his compound up there. So the Sicilian wife was a very important part of this contribution. A lot of the Sicilian women worked in the cannery. And each cannery had its own whistle, so that when their boats would come in, the cannery would blow their whistle, and the women could hear it. They knew what cannery it was. They got dressed and went down and started to pack sardines. And then every month during the full moon for 3 days or 4 days, there was no fishing, because when the moon was shining, you could not see the schools of fish in the ocean. At night, when it's dark, a school of fish, of sardine, looks like when you pour cream in coffee, you could just see it glistening. So when the full moon was up, they didn't fish, and that's when they had their dinners and their dances and their parties, because they were a very, very close group of people. So the Sicilian wife was very important to this contribution. Somebody asked about the lampara net. The lampara net was used in Italy. My grandfather had used it as a young fisherman, and when he came to Monterey, they were still using the gill net.
Right, the gill net.
And he brought the lampara net over from Italy and, I guess, reconfigure it for this bay. And it's a purse net. It's got corks on the top, and then it hangs down, and there's lead along the bottom. So when they would lay out, they'd see a school of fish, and the boat would drop off its large skiff and then make a ring around the school of fish and come back, and the net would be left off, and it would be like a curtain all the way around. And on the bottom of the net, where they had the lead, there were rings, and they would pull that together in purse. And they had to do it very quickly before the fish dropped and got away. So it was a real art, and the good fishermen, the good skippers, did very well.
Let's talk about your own recollections. Did you have a chance to meet your grandfather?
Oh, yes. Well, I knew him when he was an older man, and he was retired, and he was on the board of directors at the Bank of America here locally, and he was the leader. He was not only the key fisherman in his early life, but he was also the leader of the Italian colony, because when the fishermen came from Monterey, the first thing they do went to my grandfather, and he would counsel them. If you wanted to buy a house or build a boat, or you had trouble in your marriage, you went to my grandfather, and he counseled you. And he was a well-respected man and a very philosophical man. In fact, his nickname was Zupedo Purida, which means Peter the Philosopher. So when you would tell him a problem, he wouldn't call you a bum or anything. He would tell you a little parable about something. Maybe you'd get the message. I know that I was the first one of our family that went to college. And when I would come home on weekends with my, who later became my wife, of course, we always had to go down to my grandfather and visit with him for a while. And I remember him sitting in front of the fireplace with his stocking fisherman cap, reading the Italian newspaper. And we would chat, and of course he'd always was very generous and give me money, and I'd say, no, and he'd say, oh, yes, you do that, you need it. He was a great guy. And on Sundays, we all went to my grandmother's and my grandfather's for after Mass. We were a large family. My mother was one of 6 children, all my cousins. We'd be 25 or 30, and he had a huge kitchen downstairs under the main house, and all the family would be there for our pasta and then whatever. And there was always a mayor or a supervisor or somebody, because my grandfather was a prominent. John Steinbeck was there quite often. They were good friends. And I remember that, as a child growing up, it was very important. In fact, our family, my brothers and I, to this day carry on that tradition. We have a summer home in Carmel Valley where we get together on Sundays. And we were 50 for Easter. It's just a party place for all our family to get together and perpetuate that tradition. So, as I say, life's been good to us.
One of the things that Anna Marie Stanton, who's involved in this project, she's so interested because she's finding so many of the traditions and ways of life are disappearing fast. And she feels, she's enunciated to me the great value of especially the family meal, the things like that. And what do you remember that you see kind of drifting away?
Well, I would concur that some of those wonderful traditions we're losing them, unfortunately. But that's really up to the family. You know, I have 6 daughters and 14 grandchildren, and I have instilled and inculcated in my kids this sense of family. That's very important. My dad used to say there's only 2 things in life that are really important: your health and your family. Everything else could be a bonus. But without those 2 things, you're missing the whole point of life. So I know that the Sicilian language, for example, actually it's not a language, it's a dialect. We've kind of bastardized it here in America. I remember we've been to Italy a number of times. When I first went to Italy, I thought I was because I speak Sicilian and understand it, I thought I was speaking my best Italian. And we got to Rome and I started talking to the and the desk clerk looked, we started to laugh and said, "Oh, Siciliano's here." They don't recognize Sicily as part of Italy, some of them. But the family tradition, we still have like Santa Rosalia, which is the annual fisherman festival. I remember my grandfather was the chairman of that for years. And I remember as a kid up at his compound where all the floats were made, the bands got together and they all had, they'd serve them coffee and sweet rolls, and then they'd have the parade, etc. And it was a great tradition. See, my father was not a fisherman. And my connection with the fishing industry is through my grandfather.
Was that a problem when he decided not to be, or was that?
No, he never was a fisherman. He had other interests. He was primarily in the, he and his brothers owned grape vineyards up in between Manteca and Modesto. In fact, we had our packing sheds in Manteca. As a matter of fact, my father, who was an incredible guy, was very much like my grandfather. Very smart, determined, hardworking, ambitious, and they clashed, but they respected each other. Because every time I'd talk to my grandfather, he would give me $50, $100. He would say, "Don't tell your father, but you listen to your father." And then my father would say, "Don't tell your grandfather, but listen to your grandfather." So they had this kind of mutual respect for each other. Because my dad was very much like my grandfather. And he came over as an immigrant too. No formal education, but was an intuitively intelligent businessman, very successful in whatever he did. But he was hardworking. You know, they were determined people. And we were raised, I mentioned this before, with a strong work ethic. And my dad used to say, "I expect you to learn because you never know where you're going to end up in life. Hopefully you'll end up at the top of the heap, but you don't know that. So you got to be able to take care of yourself wherever the hell you are."
So the fisherman's life, it sounded, you know, on the surface of it, it sounded very difficult and full of drudge, but it seems like there was a lot of joy and love in it.
Yeah. The fishermen worked very hard when they're fishing. It was took a lot out of them, but they were a very happy people because they did well. And they enjoyed each other. You know, there was a lot of respect and love between them. But when they were fishing, yes, they worked hard, but they also played hard. And they enjoyed life. And as I say, they were able to rebound after the industry collapsed because I'd say the majority of them, all they knew was fishing. And when the fishing disappeared, they rebounded and started other endeavors and became successful because they had that strong work ethic.
So that leads us up to what I love about this. This is the great American experience. And the great American experience is, it lives in the past, but it also, this tradition lives in the present. So let's talk about what's left, you know, how it's manifested itself in the now.
Well, there are several groups in the Sicilian colony. One is headed by Anna Panetta, who's here, and there are other several groups that are perpetuating the Sicilian tradition. They just finished, for example, during the Lent before Easter, there's a fish dinner that's given at the parish hall down at our San Carlos Catholic Church. Anne is very much involved in that. And they serve, she was just telling me, the last dinner they served over 800 people in a Friday night. Then there's the Santa Rosalia Festival. There's the Italian Catholic Federation. There are several groups, and then there's a lot of smaller groups that have a lot of family ties to each other. And that's, it's very gratifying to me to see those Sicilian traditions and cultures carried on, because it is a great culture. It's not just the Sicilians. America was built by all of the ethnic groups that came from Europe in those days. That's what made this country great. They were hardworking, they were ambitious, and they had a great spirit of community and family and tradition. And, all throughout the United States, there are these groups, Germans, Irishmen, Italians, Portuguese, Spanish, and they've all contributed to this great America that we all love and cherish. It pains me to see some of these groups disappearing. I have tried to do whatever I could in a small way to perpetuate our Sicilian traditions and culture, because it's very important, I think. And people like Anna Panetta have carried the torch, and they're doing a great job.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Well, it's my pleasure.
As you can see, collecting this history is important. Please drop by the Museum of Monterey. If you have a story, let's talk about ways that we can capture these stories and capture this history. As you say, the past informs the present, and the present informs the future. Thank you very much.